Hello, everyone, and welcome to this virtual event hosted by the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. My name is William Wexler, and I'm the director of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted you could join us today for this discussion. When the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Jcpoa, was adopted in 2015, its implementation at the United Nations included a provision that updated existing UN restrictions on the export of conventional weapons to Iran. On October 18th, 2020, 5 years after the Jcpoa's adoption day, the arms embargo will be effectively lifted unless the UN sanctions are extended by the UN Security Council or what is called snapped back by any participating member of the Jcpoa. The Trump administration is trying to accomplish exactly that. They're trying to persuade other UN Security Council members to agree to a new arms embargo, in part by threatening to invoke those snapback provisions. Those snapback provisions can only be invoked by a participant in the Jcpoa. And there's the rub, because the Trump administration earlier said that the United States no longer was such a participant. The expiration of the UN arms embargo and the related US efforts to extend it have really important implications for regional and global players. There are some states that may be willing to sell weapons to Iran, others that may decide that it's not in their best interest. Regional states may increase their threat perception from Iran if the embargo is lifted, and others may decide that the threat level is relatively stable after all. Importantly, of course, the Iranian government would be faced with several decisions, whether or not it wants to purchase weapon systems from willing parties, what weapons those might be, and whether it can afford to make the investment. And finally, what should US policymakers know about how its partners and competitors are approaching this issue, and how to inform the US policy approach? In an effort to wrap our heads around all of these questions from all of these different perspectives, we've convened a group of foreign policy experts from around the world to provide analysis in a series of articles. Those articles were published online yesterday and is available here now. Please do look at those. They provide a lot of really in-depth descriptions of some of the issues that we're going to describe today. In brief. So I'm going to begin by asking each of our speakers just a few questions, and I'll introduce them along the way, and each speaker's article will be shared in the chat box. After a round or two of questions with each speaker, I'll open up the questions from the audience, which you can submit via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'm sure most of you are now familiar with Zoom and how we do that, but if not, you roll your cursor over it and you see the Q&A box right there. This relatively large panel is a bit of a new and different format for us, one that we think will be very fruitful and hopefully generate a lot of questions and engagement from you. So let's start at the beginning with how Iran is dealing with all of this. For that question, I'll first turn to Barbara Slavin. Barbara is the director of the Atlantic Council's Future of Iran initiative. Before coming to the Atlantic Council, she was a career journalist with the Washington Times, USA Today, The Economist, and the New York Times. She is also the author of the book, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. The article that Barbara wrote for today's event is titled Post-Embargo, Iran Arms Purchases Would Be Limited and Selected. Barbara, why don't you start off by explaining to the audience, what was the original purpose of the UN arms embargo? Why did Iran agree to it in the Jcpoa? And before this latest effort by the Trump administration to extend it, how had the Iranian leaders been preparing for the arms embargo's expiration?
Sure. Thanks, Will. We'll all try to be very brief. The arms embargo was imposed in 2010. It was part of the effort to convince Iran to negotiate limits on its nuclear program. This was achieved through the Jcpoa. Iran never wanted the arms embargo, certainly didn't want it extended, but it agreed to let it stay until 2020 under the terms of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Let me turn quickly to Dr. Robert Solda, who's an assistant professor of political studies at the University of Lodz in Poland, where we reach him today. Robert has written often about Iranian military doctrine and is the author of the book Iran 1925 to 2014, Between Reza Shah and Hassan Rouhani. On our website, you can see Robert's article, which is entitled "Lack of Modern Technologies Hampers Iran's Defense Industry." Robert, what's at the top of Iran's wish list for military purchases should the arms embargo end as scheduled in October? They want conventional capabilities, anti-ship missiles, advanced mines, surface-to-air missiles. Can they afford any of this?
Well, of course, we have to just make a guess since Iran does not publish openly strategies or documents presenting its plans. But for sure, Iranian needs are huge. They're massive. But for several reasons, which I present in my paper, large procurement of large quantities of weapons is not possible. So I would argue that Iran's goal would be to procure mainly very specific and I would say niche systems like armor, for example, for tanks, better armor, or guns for tanks, engines for tanks, avionics, or most likely, for example, electronic warfare systems. They did that in the past, a few years ago, and those systems are very, very efficient. So, for example, if Iran wanted to get a new tank, instead of buying a new systems from China or from Russia, they could follow its own project, Karar, which was revealed a few years ago. But for that, they have to procure subsystems from other country, from any other country like China or Russia. For example, effective munitions or digital fire control systems. So I would argue that Iran would try to buy subsystems, very sophisticated subsystems, rather than buying what we call off-the-shelf products.
And just, Robert, one follow-up question there. What about the anti-ship or anti-air missiles? Many commentators see those as being potentially the most dangerous, given recent Iranian attacks in the Straits.
Oh, definitely. Anti-ship missiles and cruise missiles, because this is a dual-type missile. It's a backbone of Iranian strategy. So it's also likely that Iran might try to get those missiles, or at least technologies like guidance systems or rockets from other countries, mainly from China, to boost its own systems.
Right, and you know, we saw an increase in military actions overall in over the last year by Iran. Some of it was barely deniable, you know, including shooting down of the U.S. aircraft, attacks on shipping, attacks on the energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. You know, in the wake of the killing of Soleimani, these actions seem to have diminished. Would the threat of an extended arms embargo help keep these kinds of activities in check, at least through October, because the Iranians wouldn't want to disturb the diplomacy that's going on? Barbara, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the Iranians are likely to stay a bit quiet until our elections. They can read the polls as well as anyone. They know that President Trump is in trouble. I think they, you know, I'm not sure what this would mean if he were to lose for the U.S. strategy at the UN. After all, the arms embargo is supposed to come off in October, just before our elections. But I think that it's not so much that they're worried about these things, is that they feel like the circumstances are going their way, that the U.S. is withdrawing troops already from Afghanistan, probably also from Iraq. So they've made their point. There's no need to do more.
Okay. Let me move quickly to the next big question, which is, let's say that the arms embargo is lifted, either formally or effectively. If Iran decides that it does want to purchase the kind of arms that Robert's just described to us, you know, who are they going to purchase them from? You know, the most obvious sellers that are commonly mentioned are Russia and China. So first, let's turn to Russia, and let me ask this question to Dr. Mark Katz, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. Mark is an expert on Russian policy towards the Middle East and is an author of several books on the subject, including Russia and Arabia, Soviet foreign policy towards the Arabian Peninsula, and Leaving Without Losing, the War on Terror after Iraq and Afghanistan. Mark's article that he wrote for us for this event is titled "Moscow is not buying Pompeo's Iran snapback sanctions logic." Mark, Russia is Iran's military ally in Syria. How likely is Russia to become a major arms supplier to Iran if the arms embargo is lifted in October? And what kinds of weapon systems would Russia consider selling to Iran?
Well, I'm not sure if it's going to be a major arms seller, but I think it will. It's made clear that it will be an arms seller. In other words, that they're, as far as they're concerned, the arms embargo is coming off. That they're not going to agree to renew the UN embargo, and that the argument for the U.S. snapback is simply, you can't withdraw from the Jcpoa and then invoke its provisions as a member. So I think that, I agree with Robert that they'd probably be willing to consider selling the things that he mentioned. The Defense Intelligence Agency talked about Su-30 fighters, about main battle tanks. The real question, I think, is that will the Russians sell the S-400 air defense system? That there was a report last year that Iran requested it, but that Russians turned them down, but that I think this would still be in play. And it would be a symbolic gesture that if they did this. Okay.
And we also have with us Dr. Jonathan Fulton, also an Atlantic Council non-resident senior fellow, and he is an assistant professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, which is where we reach him today. Jonathan is an expert on China's emerging role in the region and is the author of the book, China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies. His article on this subject is titled, "Will China Become a Major Arms Supplier to Iran?" Well, Jonathan, will it? China is Iran's most important purchaser of energy, and there's a signed comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries. How likely is China to become a major arms supplier to Iran? Perhaps immediately or perhaps over a longer time frame?
Short term, I think not too likely will. The comprehensive strategic partnership is something that gets hyped a lot, but what it doesn't get noticed always is that China has the same deal with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And those are very mature, established arms markets for Chinese state-owned enterprises that often serve a political as well as a commercial motivation for China. So they've got a drone factory in Saudi that's servicing customers in Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and UAE. I don't think they're going to sacrifice those established markets for a potential one with Iran, knowing that Iran doesn't really need to buy a lot of what China already has, or what China's selling. Iran has a UAV capacity domestically, so that they're not going to be buying a lot of stuff that China's already selling in the region.
Interesting. Jonathan and Mark, let me ask you both how Russia and China respectively factor their relations with other countries into their considerations regarding potentially selling weapons to Iran. Jonathan, you just mentioned that they have similar diplomatic status across the Gulf. Do Russia and China see the decisions about selling weapons to Iran in the context of a trade-off with their relationships with, say, the United States or Israel or Turkey? Or do they see an opportunity to leverage the possibility of arms sales to Iran to increase their arms sales to the Gulf? Mark, you want to start?
Right. Yes. I think that the last question is how the Russians behave. In other words, they have in the past, they have not been willing to forego arms sales to Iran in order to please other countries. But what they are willing to do is if you don't like us selling arms to Iran, well, we'll sell arms to you. And so I think that they would see this as an opportunity to leverage arms sales. Now, of course, it's a delicate balance as to how much that succeeds. But I think that, in other words, they will officially announce that they're going to be selling arms, but that this could be delayed depending on how other countries react. And I would think that, in certain concessions from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, I would think even the U.S. announcement that it's renewing this, will renew the New START treaty, would help delay this arms sale to Iran, because they want to get something in return for cooperation. And if they're not going to get something in return, then they don't see much incentive to cooperate.
And Jonathan, does China see it in a similar fashion? Do they want something in return for not selling arms to Iran?
I think the dynamics at play for China are twofold. First, it's the U.S. relationship, which of course really has shaped a lot of what China's done in the region, especially with regards to its relationship with Iran. Also, the fact that it has such deep relations with a lot of Middle Eastern countries that have difficult relations with Iran. What China is trying to achieve with its Belt and Road Initiative requires cooperation with status quo states in the region. Iran is not. So I think that closer cooperation with Iran actually doesn't really help China achieve what it's trying to do strategically throughout the region. So I'd be surprised to see them throw other regional partners under the bus to strengthen its ties with Iran, because it doesn't really fit into what they're trying to do in the region.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let's now look at some of those other regional states and explore their views. We're going to start with my colleague, Kirsten Fontenrose, who's the director of our Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Kirsten was most recently the senior director for the Gulf at the National Security Council in the Trump administration. She served under H.R. McMaster that period. Kirsten's article for us is titled, "The Gulf is Watching Washington's Moves on the UN Embargo." Kirsten, let's talk about the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which have already come up in this discussion, but of course also Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman. Are they looking for the U.S. to lead the way on this subject? How would they see the threat? And what would they do in response if the arms embargo expires and there isn't a snapback of sanctions?
Yes, Gulf countries are expecting a request from the U.S. to engage both China and Russia diplomatically about extending the embargo. The question will be, what leverage do they have? Countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the government of Yemen fully support the continuation of an embargo or a new embargo of some variety on Iran. Oman really are simply looking for an arrangement that de-escalates tensions in the region. The Gulf partners that support the continuation of embargo do not intend right now to take unilateral action. They really are waiting for U.S. guidance. They're talking to Europe, and they've said they will join international actions, but they don't intend to get out in front themselves.
No, thanks a lot. Like many countries in the Gulf, Israel's also directly and indirectly threatened by the possibility of Iranian access to more sophisticated foreign weaponry. Colonel Udi Avental, who's online now from Tel Aviv, is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy at IDC Herzliya. He wrote a piece with us with the very straightforward title, "Removing the UN Arms Embargo on Iran Will Reward Tehran's Malign Actions." Udi was previously head of the Strategic Planning Unit of the Israeli Ministry of Defense's Political Military Policy Bureau, and is the author of a weekly brief on strategic issues facing Israel in the region entitled "Spotlight: Israel in the Middle East." Udi, how does Israel's threat perception change if the arms embargo on Iran is lifted? What's going to be the impact over time on Israel's war between the war against Iran and its proxies?
Yes, hi Will, hi everybody, nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Campaign between the wars, what we call campaign between the wars, is going to be more challenging after the removal of this arms embargo. Iran is going to perceive this removal of the embargo as a carte blanche to continue its malign activities across the region, entrenching and militarily and deploying capabilities around our borders. So it's going to be the removal will boost the Iranian malign activity. This is the first point. The second point is, in the midterm, we are going to find ourselves dealing probably with more dangerous state-of-the-art capabilities that might change the balance of power. The balance of power in the region, systems like the anti-ship cruise missile Yahont that could proliferate from Iran to Hezbollah. The last point, but not least, is that the removal of this embargo and the supply of, we mentioned the S-400, advanced air defense capabilities, could give Iran a sense of immunity that will encourage it to expand more quickly its nuclear program, which from the Israeli threat perception, this is the most threatening development that could ensue, stem from this removal of the arms embargo.
No, thank you very much. The other major power in the region that is that's affected by all this is, of course, Turkey, which has been expanding its role in the wider region most recently. Most notably for this conversation is its deployment of troops against Iranian and Russian-backed forces in Syria. Saban Kardas, who's online from Ankara, is an associate professor of international relations at TOBB University of Economics and Technology. He has written a piece for us entitled "Lifting the UN Arms Embargo on Iran: Insights into Turkey's Options." Saban, is Turkey going to become a direct player in these efforts? Is it going to cooperate with the US? Is it going to try to insert itself as a negotiator? Maybe even over the long term, might it even be a potential arms seller to Iran? How do you think Turkey will approach this issue?
Well, direct player, not necessarily so. Given Turkey's previous relationship with the United States on the one hand, also Iran on the other hand, in the triangle relationship, there are already many issues. So the relationship is already overburdened. I think if a crisis is to erupt over this issue in the fall, Turkey will try to contain the fallout from this crisis for this relationship with both powers, the United States and also Iran. At this point, there are many unknowns, uncertain points, especially US elections, the future of the maximum pressure policy, so on and so forth. I think overall, the Turkish reaction will be rather a wait-and-see approach, will not try to interject itself. In terms of a negotiator or a kind of go-between, ideally Turkey would prefer to do so, but let's remember the experience from 2010 initiative, Turkey's initiative, Tehran initiative. Given that a bitter legacy, Turkey may be refrained from that. Also, the parties may not necessarily be willing to see Turkey play such a role anyway. In terms of potential Turkish supplies to Iran, or the broader question of Turkish-Iranian defense industry cooperation both ways, in that sense, I think, as I tried to argue in the paper, the prospects at this point are very limited for a number of reasons. Very briefly, firstly, the two countries are confronted regionally through proxies in different theaters in the region. They will be restrained from providing arms to each other. But also in terms of Turkish defense industry, they are very aware of the toxic nature of doing business with Iran. They will also be refrained from that. Also, as far as I can see from the industry sources, the concerns about reverse engineering, sharing sensitive technologies on both sides will also limit any potential defense industry cooperation in the short term.
Oh, thank you very much. All three of these sets of actors, Turkey, Israel, and the Gulf, have each to different degrees been really courting China over the last decade, and especially recently. And been expanding their relationships with Russia as well. For many of the leaders, have had more face-to-face meetings with Putin than they have with President Trump over the last couple of years. Let's start with you, Kirsten, because you touched on it. Have the countries in the Gulf already been raising the October arms embargo deadline in their conversations with Russia and China? What's been the response that they've received?
Not to our knowledge. We really think they're waiting for the U.S. to give them the signal that they're being asked to do this. And as was pointed out to me by several Gulf decision makers, they don't feel like they have the leverage to really move Russia or China on this. They have important strategic security relationships, trade relationships, but nothing that can really bring to bear some kind of change on this. The U.S. could put their own pressure on the Gulf to make this happen. For instance, we could go to the UAE and say, look, we turned a blind eye after demarching you on the building of a Chinese port in in the Emirates. If you are going to also tell us that you don't think you can find the time or the effort to pressure China in this instance to continue an embargo, then we have to question our relationship with you compared to your relationship with China. Where does the U.S. stand as your partner? There might need to be difficult questions because we don't see that happening right now. In a previous instance, we asked Saudi Arabia, and they were willing to pressure Russia to side with us on an UN motion that would prevent Iran from transferring weapons to the Houthis. And Saudi, so they went to Russia and said, hey, these missiles the Houthis are receiving from Iran are hitting Saudi, and we're your partner. So we really appreciate you helping to protect us. And Russia entirely blew them off. So we do understand that they really may not have that kind of leverage. While we will turn to them as the U.S. to try that conversation, I think the U.S. is going to have to be behind them, providing some incentives of our own.
And Udi, what about Israel? Bibi Netanyahu has a famously strong relationship with Putin. He had a giant poster, if I recall, on the side of his campaign building while the elections were going on of him with Putin. He also had relatively difficult conversations, I understand, with Secretary Pompeo about Israel's economic engagement with China. Is this subject, the arms embargo, already on Israel's diplomatic agenda when it has bilateral discussions with both Russia and China?
Yes, I'm sure it is. First of all, from the Israeli point of view, Russia is more important than China in this respect because we are concerned with Russian capabilities and advanced weapon system coming sold to Iran and the implications. So Russia is our main counterpart in talking about this issue. I believe the subject is going to be raised, if it hasn't been yet, also in the military channels that we have a deconfliction mechanism dialogue with the Russians military, and I'm sure we are explaining that this could lead to a more complicated situation on the ground in Syria eventually. So it is raised on the diplomatic channels. I'm not sure. I shared my paper with our foreign ministry, and I think it's a good talking point for a discussion with the Russians on the subject.
Thank you. And Saban, you said that Turkey is likely to not be directly engaged from the outset, but of course, it has avenues of discussion that many of the other actors do not, and that it meets not irregularly with both the Iranians and the Russians in the context of discussions over Syria. Do you think that the questions of the arms embargo come up in the context of those trilateral discussions?
Not to my knowledge. I would, in that respect, second Kirsten's observations about the Gulf. Probably the same dynamics also apply to Turkey's response in that manner. As far as I could speculate, I would assume that probably not much the lifting of the embargo, it wouldn't come up because in addition to what Kirsten said, the issue of leverage vis-a-vis Russia or China to influence their decisions, Turkey would also see that it's a sovereign right of Russia and China to decide how to act in that particular issue, as well as it's a sovereign right of Iran to procure arms once the embargo is lifted. So probably Turkey wouldn't seek to raise this issue in vis-a-vis these two countries, especially when it comes to Russia. The Turkish-Russian diplomatic relationships, the high-level meetings were very frequent, but they, as far as I can tell, have a lot on their plates anyway. So the agenda between the presidents, their meetings were always full. Urgent issues of Syria, Libya recently, so on and so forth. The last point to add, probably also this is a difference from Israel's point of view in that respect. If Iran were to procure such weapons, probably they won't constitute a first-order security threat to Turkey as much as it would to other actors which are covered here. So maybe that's another reason why Turkey will not be as alarmed as others, the Gulf countries and Israel.
Thank you. Now, of course, countries outside the region are equally interested in this, most notably Europe and, of course, in the United States. Let's now turn to Ambassador Michel Duclos, who is online from Paris, and Ambassador Duclos is a non-resident senior fellow, also here at the Atlantic Council. He's a senior advisor for the Institut Montaigne, a French think tank, and he's a retired French diplomat. He was ambassador to Syria, of course. Ambassador Duclos wrote a piece for us entitled "The European Approach to the Arms Embargo in Iran." Ambassador, just yesterday, the EU foreign policy chief, Borrell, was talking to reporters after he had talks with the Chinese foreign minister. And it's worth quoting in full. He said that, quote, "The United States has withdrawn from the Jcpoa, and now they cannot claim that they are still part of the Jcpoa in order to deal with this issue from the Jcpoa agreement. They withdrew. It's clear." That really doesn't seem to leave much room for negotiation with the Trump administration. How will the E3, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom approach this issue?
Hello, Will. So maybe first we have to make a distinction. What Borrell was talking about, it's more the snapback issue. Today we're focusing on the lifting of the arms embargo. I don't say that it's going to be easy to discuss with Washington on this issue, simply for the simple fact that it's very difficult for the Europeans to find someone to talk to in Washington, in the current administration. And someone to negotiate with, it's still more difficult. But having said that, the subject is so important and it's so directly linked to our security interest that, yes, I am sure that the diplomats of the E3 and other European countries will try to reach out to the American administration and to others, to the Chinese, the Russians, to try to find a compromise solution.
Oh, thank you very much. Let's go to the United States now. Let's turn back to Kirsten. Kirsten, there seems to be relatively widespread opposition to the U.S. view on the snapback provision, but potentially some negotiating room on an extension of the arms embargo in some form or another. What's the Trump administration's end game? What is it really trying to accomplish before October?
The administration is still looking at options for simply arriving at some sort of limitation on Iran's ability to up armor. So there's still several options they could pursue. They're expecting at the end of this week or maybe another week, the new 2231 report to be issued. And from what we've seen on sort of peeks into it, it was pre-briefed this Monday internally at the UN. It will attribute the Abqaiq attack in September 2019 to Iran far more directly than the last report did. It will also say that Qasem Soleimani was in violation of the arms embargo, and it will say that Houthi weapons are definitively Iranian. So the U.S. is hoping that this means it will be hard for Europe and others to brush off the embargo as having run its course and served its purpose, and that once that report is issued, there may be more backing for sort of limitation. State is not interested in concessions on the embargo. For example, a modification to allow Russia to export to Iran, but not allow Iran to do any exports itself. They're not interested in that kind of middle ground. Without an embargo, the impeded flow of weapons, as simple as like a higher volume of surface-to-air missiles, would pose a direct threat to the U.S. and its allies, planes and helicopters, things like that, even threaten the cargo planes that supply our training missions. So no matter what is believed about Iran's financial ability to purchase weapons platforms, even at the most basic and inexpensive level of acquisition, an unembargoed Iran will force the U.S. to rethink its entire footprint in the region. And that's why the U.S. is kind of not interested in these middle ground options. But it's still a live game, still a ball in the air in terms of what that would look like. Will it look like an executive order that would sanction anything that goes in and out, so that anyone who makes a screw that contributes to any particular defense system wind up sanctioned, and this would cripple the supply chains in many countries, to include Russia and China. They're still talking about which levers will be most effective.
Thanks. This deal, of course, was not just a bilateral deal, the Jcpoa, but it was endorsed by the UN Security Council, as you just noted, Resolution 2231, adopted back in 2015. So the subject is necessarily going to come up for discussion by the UN Security Council members in that context in the fall. So the final person I want to bring into this discussion is another non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council, Tom Warrick. Tom was an international lawyer by training and practice for 17 years. He was at the State Department for a decade working on Middle East and international justice issues, and then was at DHS for another decade as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism Policy. His article for us is titled, "The United States Needs to Preserve the UN Security Council's Snapback for the Future." Tom, can you start by giving us your perspective on the advantages and disadvantages of the U.S. strategy in the context of its role on the UN Security Council?
Yeah, well, the snapback provisions of Resolution 2231 and the binding power of Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter are among the most powerful tools in our diplomatic arsenal that the United States needs to preserve for the future. Historically, a Russia or Chinese veto blocks action at the UN that the United States wants, but the snapback provision says action the US wants to happen will happen unless the US decides that it shouldn't. This unilateral capability in the snapback provision is a very powerful diplomatic tool. The Trump administration interpretation of 2231 retroactively rewrites the key paragraph of the snapback provision, paragraph 11. The United States really should not want other countries to interpret resolutions against their plain meaning. We need Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7 to be binding on Russia and China according to their terms, even if Russia or China later decide that it's not in their interest after they had agreed to it. So the binding power of Security Council resolutions and the snapback provision are at risk if the interpretation of the United States is something that it insists on, because Russia or China could try to do the same thing. We need to try to preserve the power of Security Council resolutions in the snapback provision because it's one of the best ways we have of getting Russia and China to abide by their commitments to the United States, to the United Nations, and to the world.
Thank you. Ambassador Jcpoa, just picking up on that, to European ears, this is sort of a strange argument because, just generally Europeans give much more weight in general to the United Nations and the UN Security Council than Americans do in their public discourse, and certainly in comparison to the Trump administration. And France and the UK are particularly keen to maintain the institutional power of the UN Security Council, given their permanent status as UN Security Council members and their hold of the veto. How is Europe going to approach the discussions that are going to take place at the United Nations?
I'm afraid that the US will be completely isolated on this issue because the Europeans will certainly not accept the rewriting of the resolution. This is something that is beyond their imagination. So what we are going to see in the small consultation room in New York will be a very difficult and long procedural battle. And I'm afraid this is very bad from a political point of view, because we could be in a situation where the Chinese could find a way to lead the opposition to the US for the first time. I think this is an important factor. We are now in a situation where we've got a much more assertive Chinese diplomacy. They used to follow the Russians on the Iranian file. This time it could be a bit different.
Let's go to you, Jonathan, to ask a question. Do you think that China might look to, maybe for the first time, take a leadership role in the context of the UN, try to present itself as, defending the institutional prerogatives of the United Nations against the United States? Is this something that you can see China doing this fall?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with, just the dynamics between the U.S. and China right now. I mean, it's really at its worst point that we've seen really since the two reestablished relations. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson gave a statement just on Monday about this and placed the blame really squarely on the U.S. shoulders. I have it in front of me. She said, U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the Jcpoa and maximum pressure on Iran is the root cause of the current crisis. The only way to resolve this is to uphold and implement the Jcpoa. The U.S. should give up its wrong approach and avoid obstructing other parties' implementation of the nuclear deal. So they're not making, it's very clear how China sees this. They put quite a lot on the line to negotiate with Iran and the Jcpoa and cooperate with the U.S. I don't think they're willing to just throw it away, especially since they're getting a lot of flack out of D.C. right now from both sides of the aisle. I don't think they feel that they have a lot of room to maneuver with the U.S. on this.
Thanks, and Mark, let's pull you back into this discussion. Let's talk about Russia. As it happens, Russia will hold the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council in October, just on the date of the expiration of the arms embargo. How will Russia respond if the United States stays the course and, in the end of the day, tries to use the snapback provisions of the Jcpoa at that time?
I think that the Russians they have a point to make. As far as they're concerned, this is a point of principle. As I mentioned in my article, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, to quote him, for us, the case of the existing ban on arms deliveries to and from Iran was closed with the adoption of Resolution 2231. The embargo regime expires in October this year. And I don't think they're going to budge from that. And I think that, to echo what Ambassador Duclos said, that they see this as an opportunity to isolate the U.S. and the fact that the Europeans will see it in that way also, I think, heartens them. In other words, that the game here, I think, is to isolate the U.S. And that this is they see this as an opportunity to do so, which they're not going to forego.
I want to turn now to questions from the audience. We have some already, and just for those who are listening in here, please provide your questions in the Q&A function. Let me start with a question that we have from Jeff Abramson. He asks, what are the possibilities for the embargo to be extended, even in a non-formal way, such as in a code of conduct or a quiet non-public agreement? Is there something that the United States can offer Russia and China to have this kind of compromise? Why don't we start with you, Kirsten?
It's a great question. And, could the U.S., for instance, offer something in Syria or in Libya to Russia, for instance? Are there other theaters where we could look to make deals in exchange for something on the embargo? In terms of China, this is a much tougher issue. And it's really because the trade discussions are so complicated. I don't know that the U.S. Folks involved in the trade negotiations would be willing to have this complicate those further. But that is definitely still going on. And that's part of the reason that the U.S. is going to be pressuring, regardless of what we're hearing now about Europe, the pressure is going to be on. And the same with the Gulf. The pressure will be on for those folks to impact them any way they can. And then, as I mentioned, options like executive orders that would potentially cripple the defense supply chains within Russia and China themselves could be, we will not do this if you will agree. We will not cripple your supply chains by making your globally based vendor supply problematic for you if you will agree to extend this. So there's a lot of brainstorming still going on.
And Mark, do you think that Russia would be interested in a quiet deal, or will they insist on something more public for their effort?
Well, I think publicly they'll insist on their right to sell arms to Iran, but I think that there is a possibility of some kind of trade-off, sort of slowing things down. And quite frankly, I think it's the U.S. extension of New START, I also think that they are thinking about a future Biden administration, and would it rejoin the Jcpoa? And in that sense, if Iran comes back into full compliance, then or before it, there'll be some. In other words, what I think what the Russians see is that there are different opportunities for leverage. In other words, not siding with one side or the other completely, but basically giving everyone an incentive, a strong incentive, to work with the Russians on whatever it is they decide to do. And I'm not quite sure that they have decided, but this is, I think, the approach. In other words, you want the Russians not to sell arms to Iran, well, you have to give something to Russia, something valuable in return.
Let me ask you a question that we got from Faye Muqtader, who is a member of the Atlantic Council, and she asks, with all the sanctions imposed on the banking, how would the Iranians try to bypass these sanctions, and if the embargo is lifted? Why don't we start? Why don't we ask that question both to Barbara and to Robert?
Sure. I don't think that the financial sanctions would necessarily be an impediment there. Iran has found a way to continue to trade with both Russia and China despite U.S. sanctions. The bigger question is whether there is any kind of incentive for those two countries not to provide sensitive equipment to Iran. One of the things I raise in my paper is that some of these sophisticated systems from Russia would require stationing Russians on Iranian territory to train Iran, to advise them on how to use these systems. And as Faye Muqtader knows well, Iranians are very allergic to foreign military presence in the country. There was a huge uproar when Russians used an Iranian base to refuel on their way to Syria. So I think that's a further constraint on the supply of certain sophisticated Russian systems to Iran.
Robert?
Well, definitely money would be a challenge for Iran, not only because Iran does not have money to pay for major systems, but also transfer of money is a challenge also when it comes to arms. And of course, Iran could offer something in exchange, like goods or food or oil. Oil would be, I would say, a good option for China, but not for Russia. So that would be, I think, a huge challenge and a huge obstacle for Iran. Even if they had a company or a country willing to supply Iran with arms, a transfer of money would be a problem.
Let me ask a question. Maybe this goes to Tom as well. That we see, in terms of the UN discussions, Russia is going to have the presidency, as I noted, in October, so it's not likely to be tabled then. But the month before that, in September, Niger is going to have it. Is Niger going to be the subject of an immense amount of diplomacy from the U.S., from Russia, from China? For its role to influence its role in the presidency?
Well, I think that's a possibility, and in fact, I would be surprised if it wasn't already underway. The challenge is that although there's a lot of power in the presidency of the Security Council as to when a resolution gets interpreted, one of the first things that would have to be resolved would be a point of order that would probably come from Russia or one of the other countries to question whether the United States had the ability to invoke the snapback provision, which it turns on the interpretation of the phrase within 30 days of receiving a notification by a Jcpoa participant state. And so that kind of a procedural resolution then would be put to a vote, and it would not be possible for Niger by itself to override a procedural decision by the Security Council that the United States was not a participant state. This illustrates the problem the United States has with this diplomatic track that it's gone down of trying to rewrite the provisions of paragraph 11. Because by doing it, it makes it so much harder for the United States to persuade people of the merits of its argument that Iran really should not be receiving weapons, and instead turns it into a question of, as Mark said, the reasonableness and principle of the idea that Security Council resolutions should mean what they say.
Okay. Let me ask a question that comes to us from Ricardo Alcaro, who's a research coordinator at the Rome-based International Affairs Institute, and goes to something that Barbara mentioned earlier, in some ways the elephant in the room, which is that the U.S. election is coming. And so in a scenario in which there isn't a formal extension of the arms embargo, there are declarations of snapback by the United States that are not accepted by other countries. And let's say, just for the point of this discussion, that we have a new president-elect, President Biden. What does this mean for this? This is an immediate issue in front of the new president-elect. Given that environment, how should the Biden administration approach this issue? Let's start with you, Kirsten, so you can give advice to the Biden administration.
Many brilliant friends on the Biden team. I'm sure they're thinking about this, and they don't need advice. But I would say that from what we're tracking, both the Republicans and the Democrats are looking to draw down our forces from the Gulf writ large. And so, if you want to hand a victory to Iran, do that. And if the embargo is lifted, it gives both parties the excuse to do exactly that, because a heightened threat profile means you can't leave our folks in the region. We already saw a decision by the Department of Defense recently that our deployments to the Gulf will be 1 year, no longer, and will not include dependents anymore. So this is already kind of pre-staging a further drawdown. And one way to make sure that the US remains in place as a favor to pretty much the Gulf, Europe, and everyone other than Russia, China, and Iran is to keep the embargo on. So I think the Democrats are going to come under quite a bit of pressure to balance that question. Do we want to draw down from conflicts in the region, or do we want to hand the region to Iran?
Barbara, you want to raise some thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the first priority will be the nuclear issue. Let's remember that Iran is increasingly out of compliance with the Jcpoa. It now has enough low-enriched uranium to make a single nuclear weapon if it were to enrich it to a higher level. This is a direct consequence of the US quitting the Jcpoa 2 years ago. So my impression is that for Biden, the first priority would be getting the nuclear piece right. And then they would look at conventional weapons. Also, let's point out another elephant in the room, which is that Iran's strength in the region has never been its conventional weapons. Its conventional weapons, as I think Robert pointed out, are really pretty terrible. A lot of them are relics from the era of the Shah. Iran's strength has been its proxies, has been its partners, its asymmetric capabilities. And those are the capabilities, frankly, more than missiles or drones, which are, I think, pushing the United States to reduce its footprint in the region. Maybe Kirsten would disagree, but that's my view anyway.
Udi, just the last question I have on this subject, I want to go to you. Israel's relationship with the Trump administration has been especially strong. If Vice President Biden becomes President-elect Biden, and this issue is right in front of them, how will the U.S.-Israeli relationship react to this environment?
I must agree with Barbara that the nuclear issue will be the main topic of discussion between Israel and the new administration. In Israel, there are many papers written in many think tanks that advise the current government of Israel to initiate a discussion with Biden foreign policy team in order to discuss, because his plan to join back the Jcpoa and then remove the sanctions and then start negotiating on improving the Jcpoa sounds very unrealistic and raises many brows, I think, in Israel. And I think Israel would have liked to engage in a deep discussion on the issue of the Jcpoa with the Biden team.
Excellent. Let's go to a question that we have from Robert Friedman, who's at Johns Hopkins University. and this is likely to you, Jonathan. Would China be more willing to extend credits for the purchase of arms than Russia would? So not selling arms, but just providing the financial means for Iran to do so.
Sure, I see that as a way that they could actually, get around this and call it Belt and Road cooperation, a win-win opportunity for both countries. China, of course, has been doing a lot with Iran before, and I think up until 2017, they were extending a lot of credits to Iran in the event that the sanctions would kick back in. So I would see that as definitely a tool that China would use in their approach to Iran.
Okay. Let's say that we have a different scenario where the Trump administration is successful at extending the arms embargo. And one of the potential outcomes there is that has been talked about publicly is that Iran says, okay, we're going to then withdraw from the Jcpoa entirely, maybe the NPT, as well, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're going to do that, right in October as well. This is a question that comes from our old friend at the Atlantic Council, Warrick, Lutgarth. What would that potentially trigger a significant escalation of tensions in the region? Would that be seen as a complete failure of the maximum pressure campaign? Ambassador Duclos, why don't we go to you first to see what European reaction would be to that scenario?
I would say that for me, or for seen from Europe, the risk is not so much a withdrawal of Iran in case of an extension of the arms embargo. It's much more the risk of an Iranian withdrawal in case of a snapback, a success of the US and snapback. I mean, the big risk with the snapback, for instance, if there is no signs at all in that direction, but if the Brits would accept to play the game with the Trump administration and facilitate a snapback scenario, in that case, it's clear that the Iranians would withdraw, or at least there will be a very high temptation to withdraw from the Jcpoa. So that would, of course, make more difficult any option for any democratic administration. And seen from Europe, the motivation behind Pompeo's threat about the snapback is probably there. This is a fact to kill options for successor administration. For the lifting, the extension of the arms embargo, I don't see the possibility, frankly speaking, of an extension as such of the arms embargo. What I see is a possibility of some kind of arrangement among big powers on something like a code of conduct or a double restraint or a selective arms embargo, which is not exactly an arms embargo. And my sense is that if it is well done, the Iranians would have to live with that. And that should be, frankly speaking, our objective.
Robert, let me ask you, is that something that the Iranians would live with, or is that something that they would potentially react to by tearing up the Jcpoa?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
If there is not a formal extension of the arms embargo, but an understanding, a separate agreement to create a code of conduct, an arrangement that in effect continues a lot of the limitations without going as too far as to change one of the major provisions of the Jcpoa from the Iranian point of view. Would that be something that Iran would just live with, or would that be something that Iran would see as, in effect, the West once again squelching on its deal and let's tear up the JCPOA in response?
Well, I think that Iran has no other option than try to live with that. Leaving JCPOA from the Iranian side would be a mistake, because it's better also for the US to stay in the deal, because then you have more options to carry out your policy. And the same is with Iran. If they stay with the JCPOA, it's much better for them. They would have more options to carry out their policy. So they would have to live with that.
Excellent. Let me ask another question just that comes in from our audience, from Ian, Hannah, Robert, and Barbara, maybe next, and if anybody else has any other perspectives. Let's say that the arms embargo is lifted. How does that affect the various factions domestically within Iran? How does that empower the IRGC? How does that work? Who wants to take this question first? Barbara?
Yeah, no, I don't think it empowers any particular faction. In a funny way, actually, it would probably help Rouhani, whose government is a little bit embattled now. This was an important provision and something that the Iranians expected, that if they were willing to accept curbs on their nuclear program, that they would have the freedom to improve their conventional forces. So I think that this would be a boon, possibly to Rouhani, that they would see at least some reward for having agreed to the deal despite the U.S. withdrawal, despite the sanctions. I don't know if Robert agrees.
Well, I wouldn't connect those two issues. With domestic policy in Iran. However, definitely that would be an accomplishment for Rouhani. He needs any success right now. So lifting sanctions would be at least one victory for him. But also at the same time, it would be also a great achievement for hardliners, because they could also buy some arms for its military. So it would be a victory for both factions in Iran.
Similarly, as we get a question from Jassim Hussein, from a researcher from Bahrain, if the arms embargo was formally continued, would that empower the hardliners? How would that scenario affect the internal dynamics?
I think that would also, if sanctions are still enforced, it would be also a good news for hardliners, because that would strengthen their narrative that the West is against Iran and you can't trust the West. So that would be another proof to show that they are right.
Okay. Let's take one more step back. We got this question from Russ Hoyle that the end of the arms embargo is one major inflection point that's coming up, but there are others, including the Iranian presidential elections, the longer term, the succession issues, as the Supreme Leader is not getting any younger every day. How would you look at this issue in comparison with those other big inflection points that are coming towards Iran? Who wants to take this? Kirsten?
I think the presidential election is going to be critical. And I think not just because it's the election, but because of the timing of the election compared to our elections and what we've already seen in terms of the Iranian parliamentary election, for instance, because I think we're looking at a series of lame ducks right now. We're looking at the lame duck we'll have here. We're looking at Rouhani being a lame duck before their presidential election. You really won't have a chance for anyone who's empowered on either side to be decisive. Both sides of the equation, when thinking about the embargo, are going to be saying, what is a new Iranian president, what is a new American president going to do about this? So everyone's going to be hedging their bets.
Barbara?
I kind of disagree. I think that if it's a Biden victory and if the U.S. returns to the JCPOA, announces that on day one, it will give a boost to the more pragmatic elements. We still don't know, of course, who the candidates will be for Iranian president. That'll be in May or June next year. And one thing I've learned about Iranian politics is that you really don't get a sense of things until usually about a week before the election. In the past, Iranians have always voted for sort of the least worst alternative that they can find, usually anyway. And so we have to see whether this is Tweedledee and Tweedledum or whether there is any kind of real choice. And the tone set in Washington and who wins our election will have an impact on that debate in Iran.
We have another question here from Aaron Jacob for you, Tom. Can you talk us through exactly at the UN, if the U.S. invokes snapback mechanisms, what is the procedure? It's the U.S. will then be up for a simple majority vote, and just walk us through exactly what happens.
So, Will, I pasted in the chat window the language of paragraph 11. So if those who want to open up your little chat window icon, you can see the text of it. It's a very complicated mechanism. This was a masterpiece of diplomatic negotiation. And essentially what is required is that if a JCPOA participant state provides what's called a notification, that someone else is not performing its commitments, then the Security Council has to vote on a resolution to continue, in effect, the termination of the international sanctions against Iran that were in place before the JCPOA. And if that resolution is vetoed, say by the United States, then the sanctions automatically come back into force. It does not matter, for example, even if Russia or China were to want to remove those sanctions, the resolution 2231 provides they come back into force automatically unless this resolution for termination is approved by the Security Council, which means all of the permanent members have to agree. So there is a role for the President of the Security Council to play in terms of putting a text of a resolution on the table. But then as a procedural matter, it's up to the Security Council members to make procedural decisions, and that's what really gives meaning to the phrase that the notification has to come from a JCPOA participant state. The one thing we haven't seen in all of the discussions and back and forth, which was alluded to a few minutes ago, was the idea of the Trump administration putting pressure on Boris Johnson to do the deed for him. So far, British diplomats have been clear that will not happen. But I think we could see one thing that hasn't even been brought up yet, which is increasing tensions between the United States and Britain over this issue. And that would have such far-reaching consequences, it would obviously be hard to speculate.
You have a question here that actually raises a larger question from Madi from Shanghai International Studies, which asks, is the question of the overall success or failure of the maximum pressure campaign, does it hinge on this question of the arms embargo? Which raises a wider question of how do we assess, and how do the countries that we're all discussing assess the overall degree of success of the maximum pressure campaign? Is it accomplishing its wider goals? Is it on the way to accomplishing its goals? Is it being counterproductive? Why don't we start with Udi in Israel? What do Israelis think about this?
Look, it depends who you ask, because you have many opinions on this issue. I'll share with you mine. My opinion is that maximum pressure is not working because it's only economic pressure. And with economic pressure alone, you will not achieve the effect. What is missing, first of all, a military component, because today Iran understands that the United States there is no reliable military threat. Iran understands that the United States is willing to use force only in case that some American personnel if there is American casualties. Otherwise, the United States says we're not going to employ force. And I think the maximum pressure is lacking a military component. This is one. The second is that maximum pressure it's very confusing, the American stance. I think the objective, the 12 points of Pompeo, this is unrealistic objectives, and the Iranian takes these objectives as a cover for an expectation for regime change. And if you want to change my regime, how will I negotiate with you? So they are not willing to negotiate. So it has to be more. I mean, sanction also have to be limited to the nuclear deal. If you overload the sanction tools, if you put all the region, all the region aspects and the nuclear aspects. So currently, I wrote a year ago. I wrote a paper that was published in the National Interest that proposed some fixes to the current maximum pressure. Currently, I don't think it works. It has too many inconsistencies and contradiction inside that make it ineffective.
And Saban, what's the view in Turkey of the overall effectiveness of the maximum pressure campaign? Oh, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I would second the previous speaker in terms of the effectiveness. So there are also serious doubts in Turkey whether it is accomplishing its stated objectives. It is seen as a product of the inconsistencies of US policy vis-a-vis Iran overall. Also, the changes within the administration, the problematic nature of the Trump administration on certain issues, but also from the Turkish point of view, there has been always a questioning of US policy vis-a-vis Iran from the very beginning anyway, even before Trump administration. Turkey had concerns regarding a more robust policy vis-a-vis Iran. Turkey's concern has always been to ensure that the US policy towards Iran would not lead to further complications regionally in terms of the so-called destabilizing impact fallout of US actions. I think at this point, in the last year or so, given the nature of the Turkish-Iranian relationship, which has taken a new bumpy road, so to speak, especially in the last few months, given the Iranian stance in Syria as well. Maybe Turkey would welcome, ideally, US maximum pressure on Iran to limit Iran's regional ambitions. But at the same time, Turkey also realizes that it is not accomplishing the objectives, especially in not only Syria, but also in Iraq as well. Turkey realizes that that policy has not really accomplished much given the ongoing instability in Iraq. Therefore, I would also second the previous speaker's skepticism toward the policy.
Kirsten, why don't we go to you? What's your thoughts on this question?
You know, the entire point of it was to force that guns and butter decision. You either provide for your people internally or continue to support your nuclear programs, your ballistic missile programs, your proxy programs. So the administration does think that there has been success. Nobody's claiming that it's been fully successful so far. But when looking at points of success, the indicators they'll talk about are things like we've seen a reduction in Iranian provision of financial resources to Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We've seen a reduction in their provision of resources to Hezbollah in Syria, forcing them to withdraw from some entire locations. We've seen indications that the Supreme Council in Iran was asking Qasem Soleimani for indicators of his return on investment. So we know that if they were asking those questions, is the money we're giving you going toward anything useful, then it means that they were kind of thinking about whether or not this was a smart way to spend their money. The administration will also look at indicators like public discontent. So the public outcries about corruption and about the lack of provision of services by the regime means to the administration that the pressure is working, that the public is noticing that guns and butter decision has been decided for guns versus butter to their detriment. So they will say that these are some indicators of success. You know, part of the reason that we did it, you know, look at the comparative, look at the pause and escalation in Iraq. So the provision, because the US has messaged that the threat in Iraq, if it escalates again, will bring about a larger military response from the US than we've previously seen, I don't think that the administration is set, or that there is no longer, to Udi's point, a military component of this response from the US. Economic pressure is one thing. The US has not used the option for stronger military response, but they've definitely put it on the table and messaged that it is not only likely, there are plans in place should Iran choose to escalate anywhere in the theater. So I do think that has added that additional sort of threat lane in parallel to maximum pressure there.
Yeah, and let me go to Tom, but first say, for those of us who were, regardless of the question of whether the maximum pressure campaign was wise or not, the question of the potential effectiveness of it, some of us were very skeptical from the beginning. However, when you add to that historic crash in oil prices and a pandemic, suddenly you start to say those combined factors may actually have more of an impact towards the same ends. Tom, your thoughts on that?
Well, let me go back to the main point, because it always strikes me as utterly fascinating as those of us outside Iran trying to understand the thought processes of Iran to the maximum pressure campaign. I know from public statements, President Trump and some other people thought there would be immediate progress on this. But having worked at Iran in various ways since 1981, there are 3 occasions in Iran's history in which they've had to make major shifts of policy. Every single one of them has been after application of steady pressure, sanctions being the primary tool. And the amazing thing, it always looks as though Iran is not going to change its policy until it changes its policy. And it all comes back to the decision of the supreme leader. And so one of the challenges we're looking at here is there is no reason at all for Iran to do what the Trump administration wants, certainly until after it sees the outcome of the US election. At that point, if President Trump is reelected, they would have to assess whether they could withstand 4 more years of pressure, and that might produce a change. I don't think we know. If, on the other hand, Vice President Biden is elected president, then there will be a new policy come January. We've seen in cases like the release of the hostages, like the decision to end the Iran-Iraq war, which Ayatollah Khomeini likened to drinking bitter poison. We saw even the multilateral sanctions pressure that was effective in bringing about the Jcpoa. In every single one of those situations, we had exactly the same situation we have right now. So it really does come down to saying you can't know whether maximum pressure sanctions is going to be effective until after the US election. And at that point, I think the entire region and the United States and our European allies are going to need to reassess what will happen. But the reality is it all comes down in the Iranian system to the decision of the supreme leader. And anyone who wants to try to predict how he will react, I wish them all the best.
We have going to go Barbara, but first let me ask a question that I also want you to answer as well, because it's from Emma Scott in King's College in London. It's a historic question. Can you tell our audience a little bit of the negotiating history of why the provision for the arms embargo was in the JCPOA, why it had a time period that it was lifted, who was involved in negotiating this, and what was the arguments at the time?
Yeah, first of all, it's not part of the JCPOA, it's part of Resolution 2231. That's a very important distinction. The JCPOA is about the nuclear issue. It's not about conventional arms. I want to beg to differ with my colleague, Tom, who I normally agree with on almost everything. You know, Iran, yes, the sanctions have caused a lot of pain, but the situation is so different from the sanctions under Obama. Under Obama, these were blessed by the United Nations. They were embraced by Europe, which voluntarily stopped buying Iranian oil. And they were not the result of intimidation or attempted intimidation by the United States of America. There was a consensus behind these sanctions. Also, the United States made a very important concession, which was that Iran could enrich, to some extent, uranium on its own soil. Brian Hook, the special representative for Iran just the other day, once again insisted that we would have to go back to no enrichment. Well, that was the view that was held for a long time under the Bush administration, early Obama administration, and it produced nothing. In terms of the end of the Iran-Iraq war, I mean, 8 years of war, 250,000 dead. I mean, you can't compare that situation. And even there, the ceasefire that Iran accepted, Iran was in full possession of all its territory. So one can argue that it was not making a huge concession, by drinking the poison. Iran certainly can hold out until October. And given the fact that the United States is no longer the power it was, and that Iran has alternatives in Russia and China, as do many countries in the region, I would not expect that the US sanctions campaign, a line that I've used before is that sanctions are like antibiotics. If you overuse them, they lose their efficacy, and that is certainly the case.
Mark, you want to go to what was Russia's role in creating, through the UN Security Council resolution, the expiration of the arms embargo in the first place?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not a specialist on this. I think that they didn't want to see this. On the other hand, and there was a compromise, in other words, that should there be an arms embargo, should there not be? Okay, there's a time limited one. And so what they were happy about was that there was a date certain in which this was going to be lifted. But I think that the important thing to understand about Russian policy is that they are less concerned about any potential threat Iran might make, and far more concerned about the United States. And I think that what they're determined here is to make sure that any American attempt to have snapback sanctions is either fails, or if the U.S. somehow manages to go ahead with this, is deeply unpopular with America's European and other allies. Obviously, the Middle Eastern allies might be very happy, but other allies will not be. That I think is the what they see this issue as leading to.
Ambassador Duclos, do you want to talk about the history of how we got here in those negotiations?
Maybe no, Will, but I'd like to make a couple of other points.
Sounds good.
First, answering completing what Kirsten has said, there are a number of indicators, of course, to assess the maximum pressure strategy. But I think seen from Europe and especially from Paris, there is one big indicator, which is the stockpile of enriched uranium. And this stockpile today is 8 times higher than it was at the time of the signing of the Jcpoa. So this is a huge failure and a big danger for the future, because it means that very simply the Iranians are closer today to being able to go nuclear. And my second point, which is related to that and to the Russian attitude and the history of the negotiation, if you want, it seems to me that the Russians have a big preoccupation, of course, which is to keep the kind of monopoly of the nuclear status that a few of us get from the NPT, plus India and Israel. But in terms of prestige and status, they do have an interest of Iran not becoming a nuclear power. And until very recently, they thought that the US and Europe were taking care of that. So they didn't need to be too tough with the Iranians, because they thought that that was the job of others, basically. And what we see now with this administration is that simply they did not seem to be aware of the non-proliferation dimension of the subject, which is key for Russia, France, UK, and China, of course. How is it going to evolve? That, for me, one of the big unknown of this file.
Excellent. We only have just a few minutes left, so I just want to do a very quick round robin, just a few sentences each. If there's anything that you wanted to say, or at the end of this conversation that that you think the audience needs to hear, let's go around. Kirsten, why don't we go to you first?
Great, thanks. I would say just quickly that there's a school of thought that says that Iran won't be able to afford to increase its sort of national level systems. And I just want to point out to folks that the real issue is them upgrading current systems or increasing the volume and flow of things like surface-to-air missiles, not so much the purchase of major systems that their financial situation might not allow. And then from the Gulf perspective, what the main thing I'm hearing from the Gulf is that despite their differing opinions on whether or not to extend the embargo, they really would like to see the US and Europe get on one page, because Iran is able to exploit the daylight between the US and Europe on this issue. And as long as that exploitation of that daylight continues, they can continue to exploit international law as well.
Okay, Jonathan, what about China?
About China, actually, first I'd just like to reiterate the point that Kristen just made. Being based in the Gulf right now, I can vouch for her point that everybody's really hoping to see some leadership on this issue, because the longer we go, just the more untenable it feels. And yeah, it's just not something anybody's too comfortable with right here. As for China, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, it's not really about this, but one of the big issues that we've seen the administration want to work on its foreign policy coming in was North Korea. And the linkage between North Korea and Iran, to me, is a really interesting one. What's happened with the Jcpoa has made a lot of things impossible with North Korea. So for China, a lot of this stuff is really holistic, right? Like they're looking at these issues as part of a much bigger whole. So it's just been really frustrating to watch how this is played out and how it really destabilizes a lot of other regions that we might not consider.
Excellent. Robert.
Sorry. So first of all, I want to encourage all participants to read all papers, including mine. I'm very happy that I had the chance to publish my piece. So I just want to say that it's very difficult to forecast in international relations. Surprise is a constant element of our reality of our lives. So what we say, it's only a guess. We cannot be sure that it will happen. But what I want to say is that a very interesting, but also a very sad issue for me as a Polish citizen is a poor performance of the EU in the whole Iranian issue. If you look at EU policy and EU actions, EU has no capabilities, no policy when it comes to saving the Iranian deal. And also when you look at the Instex tool, it's not existent, right? So poor performance of the EU is it's also a huge problem, at least for Europe.
Great. Why don't we go to Udi?
A quick remark that was not mentioned, but it really doesn't make sense, to say the least, to remove the arms embargo. Iran has a very vicious and malign record, breaching flagrantly and systematically UN Security Council resolution that embargo with arm embargo articles. And Iran has been flooding the region with capabilities, terror organization, Hezbollah, everywhere you look, Hezbollah, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, with the militias, etc., violating those Security Council resolutions. And you cannot expect only one side, the international community, to oblige to the Security Council resolution and implement the same resolution that Iran has been violating systematically. This is my concluding remark. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, concluding remarks?
Thank you. Yes, just quickly in response to Ambassador Jcpoa, because I agree that certainly Russia doesn't want to see Iran acquire nuclear weapons. What I also think is that this isn't the highest priority for Russia. I think that if Iran does acquire nuclear weapons, they don't see Russia as being under threat from them. And further, I think certainly talking to Russian colleagues, why is it that Westerners in particular don't think that Iran is subject to the same laws of nuclear deterrence as every other nuclear power? And that they feel that they are, and that they see the U.S. has accepted it has to live with a nuclear North Korea. It lives with a nuclear Pakistan. I'm not quite sure why nuclear Iran is worse. And I think that there's just a sense that there's a degree of hysteria in the United States. Not saying that that's right or wrong, but I don't think that they are more sanguine about the possibility than many of us are. On the other hand, they don't want to see it happen, but that if it does happen, then I think that in other words that there will be deterrence. There will be other things. In other words, that the same limits that apply to other nuclear powers will apply to Iran. Iran is not that much different from other states.
Okay, Saban, quick ending comments.
From a Turkish point of view, I think this discussion reiterates one of Turkey's inherent concerns about the US-Iran disputes, which I also highlighted. The unresolved status situation of the Iran issue in the region internationally will continue to create problems continuously. This is a concern for Turkey. I think also in this issue, the need to find a just solution that also takes into account main international law principles, sovereign right to have access to trade, access to international economic system. I think for Turkey, it underscores once again the need to solve the Iran file in the region. Otherwise, it will be perpetuate source of further tensions, which Turkey has to manage in its relationship with the United States, in its relationship with other regional actors. So this triangular source of problems, unless a just solution is found, will be there for Turkey. It's just yet another reminder.
Thank you. Tom?
So one thing that needs to be borne in mind is that there is actually strong bipartisan support in Washington for efforts to try to extend the arms embargo. I think if the Trump administration dropped trying to make an issue out of the snapback provisions and went to a much more traditional campaign, just as we've heard on this conference, our country, our allies in the region don't want to see Iran get weapons. The Europeans don't want to see Iran get destabilizing weapons, and it's not really in the interest of China and Russia, apart from making the US look bad or perhaps for commercial reasons to try to sell such weapons. And they have more attractive commercial markets elsewhere in the Gulf. It really does look as though the coalition that the Obama administration built that made the JCPOA happen in the first place might actually be available to try to rebuild a coalition to at least limit, if not completely restrict, arms to Iran. And that being the subject of this discussion, it is kind of amazing that we're talking about snapback, which is a highly controversial move, when the more obvious traditional hard slogging of diplomacy is almost certainly likely to lead to more success than what we're seeing right now.
Ambassador Duclos.
Thank you for this excellent conversation, Will. I would conclude in the same line as what Tom has just said now. That is to say that the arms embargo business should not be a big deal. It's not a major problem of the size of the nuclear issues or the regional behavior of Iran. And it's an issue on which there should be some convergence and maybe a high degree of convergence among the major stockholders. And it should have been dealt with in a discreet way through diplomatic channels. And my hope is that it's going to be like that. We can return to this safe channel. Thank you.
And Barbara, you got the first word, you got the last word. Take us home.
Sure, thanks so much. I concur with what Tom and Michelle have said. And I think if we've learned anything over the last 3.5 years, it's that foreign policy of intimidation does not work well. The United States is at its best when it works with its partners. That was the secret sauce of the Jcpoa and of the sanctions that preceded it. And yes, Iran cheats and has cheated, but that was a powerful indication that diplomacy can have a big effect, certainly on its nuclear program. I'm sure my Israeli colleague would agree. So we need to return to multilateral solutions. And I hope that the administration will give up this silly notion of snapback. And, it may sound good, but it's very counterproductive.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you very much to our audience here. This was an absolutely wonderful discussion. We had a large number of people, but very much appreciate all the really valuable insights that you all brought to this conversation. Thank you very much.